Okay, I think we can start. Welcome to the 100 years of the South African Communist Party webinar titled The Debating Lineages of Socialism in Africa. My name is Tshepo Moloi, based at the University of the Free State, the Department of History. Today's seminar or webinar will be discussing strategic debates, the ANC-SACP alliance and the Soviet Union. We have the webinar will run up to 5:30, 17:30, and good afternoon and good morning to others. I know that Alex is still in the morning where he is. Before I introduce the panelists, I think I would like to thank a couple of people for making this webinar a success to take place today. In no particular order, Alex Stewart, not Alex Stewart, why do I say Alex Stewart? Lawrence Stewart, thank you very much. Lawrence will be helping us with the technical aspect of the webinar. Arianna from the History Workshop also assisted immensely. And Pulani Kaba, who's not here, probably join us later, our department's administrator. We have 6 presentations and a discussant towards the end of the discussion by our panelists. We have Patrick Mangashe, Arianna Lissoni, Rachel Sandwell, Hilary Lynd, and Vladimir Shubin and Daria Turianitsa. So we'll go in that order. Each presentation will be 15 minutes, and then after the panelists presented, we'll give Alex time to reflect on the papers. We'll also give him 15 to 20 minutes. Thereafter, I'll give each panelist 5 minutes to respond. Thereafter, we'll open the session to the attendees to ask questions or make comments. So just to indicate that we have the chat platform. If you want to ask a question, just post a question on the chat platform, or you can indicate if you want to verbalize your question, then I'll come back to you to ask the question. I think what we can do so that we don't cloud the panelists with the questions, we'll take a round of 5 questions and then they will respond, and then we'll take another round, and time permitting we'll go on. So without further ado or waste of time, I will ask Patrick to give his presentation. But before he does that, let me just go through his short bio so that those who do not know Patrick might have an idea who Patrick is. Patrick Mangashe holds a master's in history from the University of Fort Hare and is presently doing his PhD. His experience as a former Umkhonto weSizwe combatant has shaped his research. He is a member of the Oral History Association of South Africa and uses oral history as a research methodology in his studies of Umkhonto weSizwe. He has published papers on South Africa's liberation history and politics, which include Operation Zikomo, the armed struggle, the underground and mass mobilization in South Africa's border region, 1986 to 1990. And through the experiences of MK, 2018 publication, and OR Tambo in the period of the ANC's illegality, 2019 publication. Patrick, we have 15 minutes. We can start.
Thanks, Dr. Moloi. My account starts with the banning of the SACP, and I note that the introduction of the Suppression of the Communism Act of 1950 Though it had one of its principal aims to root out communism from society, yet its activities and influence within the extra-parliamentary opposition circles in South Africa did not decline any significantly. Instead, Communist Party members learned to work under the new conditions that were given to them by the banning, and this led to an acquisition of experience on underground work, which came in handy when the ANC itself was ultimately banned a decade later. And that when the Sandwell massacre took place and the move to armed struggle occurred, the South African Communist Party and its members were firmly among the most active in the sphere of struggle, the armed struggle. From leading the theoretical debates on the possibilities of revolution in South Africa, in the publication Africa South at the close of the 1950s, people like Professor Jack Simons, Michael Hammer, to leading those debates, to the practical steps taken towards this course of action after Sandwell, the formation of party sabotage cells at that time. The SACP was to be a joint leader in this effort, in the armed effort with the African National Congress. From the 1961-62 sabotage campaign era to the June 16 generation, therefore, MK in itself and then the broader armed struggle benefited from the underground experience and the discipline of the SACP. A significant number of the leading cadres of MK making up the high command were members of the Communist Party. I realized when I was counting them that it was more members of the Communist Party, in fact, in MK's high command, apart from Nelson Mandela. Joe Slovo, Raymond Hlaba, Rusty Bernstein, Bram Fischer, Ahmed Kadrada, Govin Mbeki, Walter Sisulu. The main authors of Operation Maibuye are Slovo and Mbeki. And the importance of Operation Maibuye in the INC's armed struggle is also that it laid the basis for all thought concerning the conduct of the people's armed effort against apartheid. For it states the intention of the armed struggle and the main elements that are necessary for such an armed effort, from a nationally coordinating structure, the high command and its substructures. It establishes a propaganda machinery, including a radio mouthpiece, to train a nucleus of military personnel abroad who would in turn reproduce themselves inside. The establishment of reception committees inside, the careful choice of targets, the role of the ordinary people. In other words, as Joe Slovo says, even with the limitations that are sometimes pointed about Operation Maibuye as a document, but then whoever after that embarked on the armed struggle in South Africa had to take something from Operation Maibuye. The point is that the members of the Communist Party were also prominent in the early MK substructures, in the command substructures. In Joburg, you had Elias Mtsoaledi in the Natal's High Command. You had Kenning Glovo, Billy Nair, Ronnie Kasrels. In the Eastern Cape, some of the most prominent were members of the Communist Party, like Vusilemini, for instance. The Western Cape, Dennis Goldberg and others. The early MK instructorate also consisted mainly of members of the Communist Party, in Fred Kennison, Jack Hodgson, Dennis Goldberg, Elias Mtsoaledi, among others. In other words, these people who were responsible for the creation of MK to lay the basis for the creation of MK, training others, imparting knowledge, a very important function in any new guerrilla army. Now, continuing in this vein, production and dissemination of knowledge among MK members, building MK, and the shaping of the mind of the cadre, in later years, at least from the period of the June 16 detachment, Communist Party members like Professor Jack Simons, Mark Shope, at Or Tambo's behest, were pivotal in setting up MK's politics department. Professor Simons becomes responsible for compiling MK's politics curriculum that was to form the basis of the politics training program overall from then onwards for all successive MK's training detachments. The Bram Fischer group that survived to carry on the work after Rivonia, even in the face of tremendous odds, had embodied the spirit of selflessness as a leaf out of the SACP book, which was infused into MK ranks as the main working principle. Selflessness. This is exemplified in the MK slogan, long live the spirit of no surrender. It is not merely a slogan, as we see for this was displayed in both combat and in captivity. And to support this, there's lots of stories. Other part that is important is the non-racialism of the Communist Party, which serves to place potentially divisive tendencies like ethnic tribalism far down the consciousness of the MK cadre. For if we consider the impact that the bantustan system was meant to have had on the consciousness of South African Blacks, and if one looks at the examples of other guerrilla armies on the African continent and they are grappling with the issues of tribalism, the ANC didn't actually have this at that extent. It is, I'm saying, not that it could be said that this tendency, tribalism, was absolutely absent in the ranks, but it was subdued by the introduction of an even higher ethos, the ethos of non-racialism. The official policy and general feeling was that of non-enmity towards the white group, those who made up the bulk of the personnel of the principal enemy. Then it would have been extremely difficult to tolerate encroachments to unity by allowing ethnic tribal sentiment to thrive in the ranks. Also, that the presence of white members among the leadership of MK also strongly served to reinforce the official non-racial ideology of MK, which was firmly embraced by the majority of its ordinary members. The ANC, and particularly MK, also took the ideological leaning and praxis of the Communist Party, including the influence of the SACP on the ANC strategy and tactics, and therefore on its approach overall to the armed struggle strategic thinking. The very turn to communist Vietnam for its strategy review effort almost a decade after MK's formation, in my opinion, also becomes testimony to the influence of the SACP's views on the armed struggle. There were also practical benefits derived from the friendship struck by the SACP among members of the international socialist movement, including those on the African continent. For they were among the first to be welcomed in a free Angola and were able to forge close links with Samora Machel's Mozambique that had also declared itself in favor of the socialist line. These friendships led to the easy acceptance of the ANC and the availability of training facilities for MK in these countries. And also that these friendships included general cooperation, including the sharing of intelligence information. And so MK, though a relatively young guerrilla army at that moment, is thus elevated to the status of a promising guerrilla army because of the contacts that it has, courtesy of the South African Communist Party. And the work performed by SACP figures like Yusuf Dadoo in this regard were not kept secret at MK, which further enhanced the party's prestige among MK members. Apart from the Soviet Union main supplier, sponsor, smaller specialization groups were also trained in the socialist countries like the German Democratic Republic, Czechoslovakia. MK cadres are sent for training at party schools, communist party schools, and this further brought the element of a strong preference for the socialist ideology at MK. And I've known that the MK's doctrine, if a guerrilla army could have had a doctrine, was inclined towards socialist thinking or influenced by that. Concept of the People's Army, the purpose and motivation of this army, the relations in this army, the commissar practice, which was important at MK, is taken out of the Soviet Red Army traditions. The first to deploy, the last to withdraw. This is true of the influence of the SACP and the Red Army. The influence of the commissariat on the moral ethos and political direction of MK also is testimony to this. The armament and traditions of MK became socialist traditions. The colonial subjugation as an experience in South Africa had led to an interruption in the development of indigenous military traditions. So they could not be carried on the way in which our people had fought before, in weaponry, in military formations, in command structures, were killed altogether. So they became totally obsolete and could not be used in the modern era. But this void in both knowledge and military traditions in the modern was to be filled totally by the Soviet army. So altogether, MK takes on the Soviet military traditions as their own. MK standard weapon is the AK-47, product of the Soviet Socialist Union. But this also goes for the rest of the other weaponry, the explosives, mines, artillery, the anti-air, etc. All these are Soviet weapons. The tactics are those of the Soviet Red Army, but adapted to guerrilla conditions. The training curriculum was opaque, and all other military equipment, radio, uniform, food, transport, magazines. Even the dominant drill language becomes Russian on MK's parade. The indisputable global superiority of Soviet conventional arms at that moment especially further reinforced this confidence in the Red Army and in the ability of the socialist system as a contending system to the already known but discredited capitalism. So capitalism and colonialism tended to go together, while socialism had yet at that moment to be associated with colonialism itself and human exploitation. Soviet literature dominated at MK, from Lenin as leader and theoretician of the Russian Revolution to Nikolai Trotsky to Sholokhov, Boris Prokofiev, and others. Stories of the feats of valor performed by units and individuals of the Soviet Red Army during the Great Patriotic War inspired MK cadres. From Alexander Matrosov, as the word goes, Matrosov Nyadva Prosi, he went on and covered a machine gun position with his body. This is an expression of patriotism, of selflessness. This story becomes popular at MK. Almost everyone sees themselves as a Matrosov. We know today that Stalingrad has become part of South Africa's political lexicon. Everybody in South Africa talks of Stalingrad. I think this shows also the influence of the SACP, its language, its traditions, its leanings. As does the Vietnam heroic struggle and the tactical and strategic lessons that were to be drawn from there. The Cuban contribution in the building of MK was also of great value, from being responsible for the military training of the new June 1976 recruits in Angola to availing themselves afterwards for further specialized political and military training. So the Soviet Union, Cuba, Vietnam, and other countries of socialism sharing the same ideology with and drawn by the SACP to the full assistance of MK, because in the middle of these countries, this ideology stands the SACP as the glue that brings them all into MK, into the arms struggle. The first skirmishes where MK was involved were to be in Wanki, where party cadres like Krisani showed their mettle, both as ordinary fighters and as leaders. Joe Slovo, Ronnie Kaspers, outstanding party cadres in leadership roles at MK in the arms struggle. Gordon Dikebu, Bryce Njongwe, Obadi Mkhabude also stand as other examples of communist cadres who held the example of the spirit of the party within MK, from their daily conduct in the camps to their performance in practical combat. I have here Isaac Hoji, also a member of the South African Communist Party and MK cadre, who survives inside the country. So far, I think the longest, in as far as my research is concerned, from 1983, he was deployed in 1983, end of 1983 to 1990. He actually survives the whole time. I haven't heard another example that matches his. And all this points to the discipline that the South African Communist Party was also able to infuse into MK. Isaac Hoji is captured only later, after the unbanning of the ANC, only as a show of malice on the part of the security police. So by all these acts, the members of the SACP carved a place for themselves as heroes of labor, heroes on the battlefield, and all of this commendable display contributes to the prestige of the party in the eyes of most MK members. And in spite of the fact that they set their bar that high, almost all members of MK would have been proud to be members of the Communist Party. And in fact, recruitment into the ranks of the SACP became an acknowledgement of individual excellence at MK. Also, the fact that communist ideology was regarded as a universal theory also plays a significant role among MK members, as it brought a sense of belonging to a wider world community that held strong views against racism, against injustice. The record of the stance of the Soviet Union against apartheid in world bodies like the UN is clearly in evidence during this period. MK has a firm representative in the Socialist Community of Nations, the SACP. And so once the impact of the contribution of the International Brigade, Alex Mumbaris, the London recruits, once again, it is members of the SACP like Ronnie Castrils took the lead in drawing them in. And Kader Asmal's untiring work in the anti-apartheid movement, a body that is regarded as having been the largest international political assembly yet seen. All of these that I've mentioned, I'm saying Ronnie Castrils, Kader Asmal are members of the SACP. Also at MK, Wolfie Kodesh became MK's first quartermaster. And in this role, he sets the standard for an efficient MK logistics system from, as I say, from boots to books. I've already spoken about the military armament. Now, I note here that MK libraries, because of the work that Wolfie Kodesh did, became the most well-stocked collection of reading material in any ANC establishment, perhaps outside Somafco. At the end, I needed to say there were moments of lapses, however, where communist influence in the ranks of MK seemed to wane. As at the moment in the mid-60s when Slovo, Dadu, and others were banished to London. And MK engages in the Wangis Polilo campaigns. And I say now waned, the SACP's influence wanes here because what I see is that there's a sense of lukewarm support on the part of the SACP towards these campaigns. But the overall official SACP line is that of support for the bravery displayed by members of MK during these encounters with the people's enemy. But the party seems to stop short of wholly endorsing these actions. But as already mentioned, during the Wangi campaigns, members of the Communist Party were seen to have given their all and to have set the example. There was also the period of mutinies at MK at different moments. The Ani Memorandum seems to stand as an indictment of the behavior of the leadership of MK, and more importantly, a call to correct such weaknesses. That thus called, the memorandum is clearly not Christian alone, but he plays a prominent role in its drafting and thus comes to be its personification. The analysis of the problems is clear and challenging to the leadership, though not an instigation to rebellion against the MK leadership, but a call for correction of such weaknesses in as far as they impacted negatively on MK's ability to play its intended role. Later, there's the Mkatashinga incident, and these missteps at MK become obvious. There's this Zapo Toy influence that comes in also. James Nwulu speaks about this one, and Stanley Malone in their works also mention this. There's a kind of lack of political direction in MK at this moment, especially the tampering with its training program. So I ask myself these questions in my mind: were these the weaknesses of the party in their ability to minimize the negative material or to timelessly detect and be able to deal with them? For this moment, the party already had a vast network of political units in MK, and thus had the opportunity to at least foresee the possibility of such occurrences or to detect the feelings of MK members. And I know that here, as I note, Professor Shubin in his work review from Moscow does mention the discussions between OR Tambo on the one side and the Communist Party leadership on the other, on the advisability of creating party cells at MK. But at this moment in the 80s, the party had established cells already at MK in almost every significant unit. From the politics department, the communications, security, I would dare say in most significant units, SACP cells were there, but this moment slipped through them. Mkadashenga happened.
Excuse me, Patrick, sorry to cut in. Do you want to just conclude, then you can engage when questions are raised later with some of the issues that you want to discuss?
Okay. In my conclusion, I needed to say that the SACP had a positive influence on the development of the armed struggle, strategic development on MK itself from its inception throughout. And that the party's dominant ideology shaped the minds of MK combatants, gave them a sense of belonging ideologically. But that, as I'm saying, there were weaknesses at MK at some moment, which also, in my opinion, must be given over to the party. Thanks to Moloi. I'm fine.
Thank you very much for it. I'm so sorry to interrupt you. It's just gone. Thank you for the interesting presentation, how the MK and armed struggle benefited from SACP. I'm sure when you open up the session to questions and comments, you'll be able to engage some of the issues. Our next presenter is Arianna. She'll be presenting on the ANC, the SACP, and Bantustan independence in inverted commas. Arianna works as a researcher in the Wits History Workshop. Her research and publications focus on the history and politics of the liberation struggle. She has co-authored, co-edited books, 100 Years of the ANC, the ANC Between Home and Exile, Reflections on the Anti-Apartheid Struggle in Italy and Southern Africa, and the New Histories of South Africa's Apartheid Era, Bantustan. And finally, she co-authored Congolos, a short history of the ANC in Northwest Province, 2016 publication. Arianna, you've got 15 minutes to do your presentation.
Thanks, Tshepo. Let me do this. Thanks, let me start. So growing research on the late apartheid period and the transition shows how the Bantustans became significant battlegrounds in the war over South Africa's future. And these histories, as Laura Evans reminds us, a reminder that the transition was not just about elite politics and negotiations, and that the political violence in the Bantustans crucially gave shape to it too. And in fact, threatened to derail the entire negotiation process right up to the days of the first democratic elections in 1994. In the end, the Bantustans as a political project may be viewed as a historical failure, as they were all reincorporated into a unitary South Africa as part of the country's new provinces. But while dead on paper, the Bantustan octopus, as Governor Mbeki presciently described their reach in his book, The Peasants' Revolt. This octopus has continued to stretch its tentacles into the post-apartheid period. In other words, the Bantustans as historical realities have had prolonged afterlives, and they've produced complicated legacies that South Africa is still dealing with today. An example of this is the much contested traditional courts bill, which has now been put under review for its constitutionality after years of resistance by rural activists and civil society groups. The Bantustans have their origins in the so-called native reserves and early segregationist legislation that sought to set up a separate legal and political regime for these areas, while at the same time bringing the surviving African chiefdoms under the direct control of the state. In 1951, the apartheid government passed the Bantu Authorities Act, which set up tribal, regional, and territorial authorities in 8 ethnic areas for the administration of Africans in the reserves. And the idea was that these territories would become autonomous states through being granted self-government and then independence. And in 1976, the Transkei was the first Bantustan to be proclaimed independent, followed by Bop, Venda, and the Ciskei. And in the context of the collapse of Portuguese colonialism in the mid-70s and growing international condemnation of apartheid, Bantustan independence was presented to the world as Pretoria's contribution to decolonization, or its own version of an internal settlement. Politically, from the time of the introduction of Bantu authorities, the ANC and its allies in the Congress movement unequivocally rejected the National Party's Bantustan plan. However, in terms of strategy, the response to the unfolding of Bantustanization was a more complex matter, which evolved over time. My paper is about the debates that took place in the liberation movement in the 1970s, central to which was the Communist Party, and which were in part prompted by the granting of independence to the Transkei in 76. And it's an attempt to combine two of my sort of ongoing research concerns. One is an interest in the history of the South African liberation movement in exile, and the other one is an interest in the histories of the former Bantustans, which has been growing into a distinct field of research in recent years. I'm going to focus on 3 streams of discussion that were happening in this period. The first 2 are within the ANC and the SACP in exile, and the third is amongst political prisoners on Robben Island. In the full paper, I have a whole section on the historical development of the land question within the liberation movement, starting from the founding of the ANC through to the ICU period and the rural upsurge of the late 20s, the Native Republic resolution of the CPSA, up to the period of rural revolt from the say late 1940s to the early 60s, and the turn to armed struggle in this period. But I'm just gonna skip all that and go straight to the 70s, when the Bantustans re-emerged as a sort of significant topic of discussion. By then, 8 ethnic Bantustans had been created, another 2 would be added later, and they were seen as posing a number of strategic and tactical challenges for the prosecution of the liberation struggle. And amongst the first to apply their minds to these issues were members of the ANC's youth and student section as part of an ANC summer school that was held in the GDR in 1971. And Tshepo later reported on this summer school and the debates around the Bantustans that took place then. The debates centered around 2 contributions to papers by Billy Nanan and Thabo Mbeki that shaped the discussion. There was unanimous agreement among the participants that the ANC should continue to oppose the Bantustans and expose them as frauds. But for the first time, it was also suggested that independent structures should be set up by the ANC in the Bantustans, both political through the underground and military. And also it was suggested that the movement should use all legal avenues in order to take up the day-to-day issues that affected people in the Bantustans. A second stream of contributions came from the leadership on Robben Island, and took the form of a series of papers that were written in prison just before the outbreak of the Soweto uprising, and then smuggled out by Mac Maharaj when he was released later that year, and then they were published almost 25 years later in a book called Reflections in Prison. Anyway, these discussions on the island then also fed into what was happening in exile, and two broad positions emerged with Nelson Mandela and Walter Sisulu calling for a review of the boycott tactics and an engagement with Bantustan politics that was based on a consideration of Bantustan independence as an accomplished fact. And Govan Beki arguing that actually independent Bantustans would just join hands with the apartheid regime against liberation forces. And so only a sharpening of a conflict between the regime and the liberation forces could turn the tide against the oppressor. Thirdly, the evolution of a strategy concerning the Bantustans can be traced within the SACP from around 1973 onward through a number of political reports, statements, and articles, many of which were published in the African Communists, and these included an analysis of the internal and external situation as a background for understanding the regime's drive towards Bantustanization. I mentioned the independence of the former Portuguese colonies, but also growing international condemnation, economic recession in South Africa, and most importantly, industrial and political action that was starting to take place amongst workers and students inside the country. The party's main contribution, I think, lay in the class perspective that it added to the discussion, focusing in particular on the emergent black middle class and its role. Key to the regime's Bantustan strategy was the deliberate creation of an administrative elite and business class, a project driven through the Bantu Investment Corporation and its subsidiaries. And this was seen as wholly dependent on the state for their economic survival, and so as largely antagonistic to the liberation movement's aims. But the black petty bourgeoisie, made up of small businessmen, professional groups, and minor administrative posts, was seen as vacillating between the ruling and the exploited classes, depending on their respective strength. And the party argued that it was the liberation movement's task to win sections of a black petty bourgeoisie over to its side in support of the National Democratic Revolution. In the light of this, the party started calling for flexible tactics in the fight against the Bantustans, which meant that boycotts and non-collaborations should not be viewed as absolute principles, but as tactics whose successful implementation rested on the levels of organization of the people on the ground. Every platform, it argued, should be used to advance the struggle, including those provided by the government. And while it was understood that participation in this kind of legal activity may require silence on certain questions, open condemnation of the liberation movement's policies, for example, Buthelez's open rejection of the armed struggle, was not deemed acceptable. The issue of individual Bantustan leaders, particularly Buthelezi and Inkatha, and their motives became one of the most contested aspects of this debate on the Bantustan in the liberation movement. And the differences came to the fore as part of an internal party discussion based on a 1978 document that was titled "Fight the Bantustans from Within and from Without, a reappraisal of our policy." While calling for the creation of a broad front of groups and organizations opposing independence in the Bantustans, The discussion document argued that it should be irrespective of their acceptance of the liberation movement strategy of armed struggle. Perhaps reflecting the ANC's positive attitude to Buthelezi during this period, the document welcomed his opposition to the independence of KwaZulu as a positive stand that could strengthen our broad front. This document was circulated to all party units for comment, and all of these were recorded and distributed as part of a bulletin in early 1979, and 18 different responses were recorded. And copies of both the document and the responses were also sent to the leadership of the ANC with a view of reaching a consensus position. On the whole, units expressed support for the document's main line of analysis and the call for flexible tactics, but sharp differences emerged over parts of the tactical section of the document that dealt with Inkatha and Buthelezi, whom many did not trust and saw either as a potential future stumbling block or as poised for a counter-revolutionary role. One unit argued that while posing as against independence, Buthelezi was actually helping the Bantustan project succeed, and in spite of his popularity, he was also against all the major principles of the liberation movement, notably the armed struggle and the international boycott, both economic and cultural. So this meant that when it came to Inkatha, the party's task should be to win away its popularity, and that cooperation with people that worked within dummy institution as part of broad front politics would only have to be possible on the basis of mobilizing people against such institutions to destroy them or neutralize them. One of the first public critics of Buthelezi in this period was Comrade Nzala, who wrote, as early as '78, wrote an article in the African Communist, which denounced Inkatha's compromising role. And Ronnie Casrell spoke in an earlier webinar in this series of Nzala's subsequent research during his time in Swaziland, which culminated in his exposure of Buthelezi's duplicity in chief with a double agenda, which was published at a time when the confrontation between the ANC and Inkatha was shaping up in 1988. Anyway, the various streams of discussion I've been describing sort of came together into a collective strategic consensus that was articulated in the report of a political military strategy commission to the ANC National Executive Committee, which is better known as the Green Book because of the color of its cover. While rejecting the Bantustans and other government-imposed institutions amongst coloureds and Indians, the Green Book concluded that from a tactical point of view, there was no single route which will mechanically lead us towards the destruction of these institutions. And this opened the possibility for participation in Bantustan politics, where such participation advanced the liberation movement's aims. It contributed towards the undermining of such bodies and exposing and isolating out-and-out collaborators. In Annex G of this document, the implications of this policy were analyzed in more detail, and the following areas were identified specifically in terms of new possibilities for advancing mass mobilization in the Bantustans. The first was the struggle against accepting independence, the use of all means, including legal platforms, to defeat the government's Bantustan policy, resistance to mass removals and resettlements, and mobilizing for land redistribution, rejecting any measures that deprived Africans of their South African citizenship, opposing international recognition and opposing international recognition and calls for foreign investment. And in retrospect, many of the recommendations that were contained in the Green Book, I would say, did indeed evolve in the course of the struggle over the next decade. So by way of conclusion, let me just make a few points about the significance of these debates. First of all, I think they're evidence of a culture of debate within the liberation movement, which continued during the period of illegality and in exile, and even within the highly repressive space of Robben Island. The debate on the Bantustans represents a serious effort on the part of the liberation movement to engage with social, political, and economic developments that were taking place inside and outside of South Africa, to find a common understanding of these processes, and so that these could serve as a basis for a joint action. The processes involved in reaching a collective position of consensus on the Bantustan question also speak to the dynamic nature of the alliance between the ANC and the SACP, and how this worked in practice, which challenged narratives that were promoted in the first instance but by the apartheid regime, and more recently by scholars such as the late Stephen Ellis, who have argued that the ANC was effectively controlled by the SACP, which in turn took their orders from Moscow. And secondly, these debates over strategy and tactics in relation to the Bantustans, I think, opened up new opportunities for the liberation movement to reconnect with its internal base on the ground by being able to connect with and support struggles that people on the ground were involved in. And of course, neither the ANC nor the SACP could fashion history at their will, but these developments, I think, played a part in the intensification of internal resistance during the following decade and into the 90s, when the Bantustans emerged as key sites of struggle. At the same time, the debates analyzed here also paved the way for more complex entanglements between the liberation movement and the Bantustans, whose ramifications it could not predict. And I'm going to end with a quote by Walter Sisulu from his 1976 prison essay, in which he wrote, "What strange and difficult moments independent Bantustans will set in motion until we reach that goal of one South Africa, one nation, one person, one vote, are matters that lie ahead in the future. We shall only experience their full impact when the revolution has triumphed over apartheid." So to return to the present context and the traditional courts bill, South Africa is indeed grappling with the Bantustans' enduring legacies, and one of the issues that appears to have been completely missed and underestimated in the debates of this period is in terms of both the significance and the role of traditional leadership and the kind of comeback that traditional leaders were able to make from the time of the emergence of Controlesa and into the post-apartheid period. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Arianna, for a very interesting presentation on the diverse views about the Bantustan in the ANC, in Exile, and Robben Island, and the SACP. I'm sure this will evoke some interesting questions later. Our third presenter will be Rachel Sandwell, who will be talking on women and gender in the SACP in Exile. Just quickly go through her bio. Rachel Sandwell is a faculty lecturer in the Department of History and the Institute for Gender, Sexuality and Feminist Studies at the McGill University in Canada. Her work explores histories of women's thought and women's political engagements and intersections between gender, sexuality, the state, and resistance movement. She has a particular interest in the history of global left feminism. She is currently completing a book manuscript on women and gender in the African National Congress during its exile period, and has published most recently in the Journal of Women's History. Rachel, 15 minutes, you can start.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much to the organizers in general. I've really enjoyed all the previous events in this series, and I'm very thrilled to have the chance to be here. So thank you very much. So my title is very broad, but I won't attempt to survey all that could be said about the big topic of women and gender in the SACP during the exile period, roughly 1960 to 1990. Rather, I'll focus on how we can begin to consider these histories and what are some ways into these topics. As Tom Lodge remarked yesterday at his book launch event, women were made part of the leadership of the South African Communist Party much earlier than for other political organizations of the period, prior to exile. Yes, it's true that the overall political and social climate of the time was patriarchal. It's true that membership was majority male. And it's true that women in leadership were the exception rather than the rule. But they were there, and I would argue that there has in fact been under-theorization of the import or significance of women's presence in party leadership, which is to say, insufficient attention paid to what this presence meant for the party and what it meant for women at the time. Of course, there's important exceptions, among others, Alison Drew and Cheryl Walker have written on women in the early days of the party, as has Shubin Hassim. More recently, Paul Landau has written on Ruth First, MK in the party, and there is, of course, Robert Edgar's illuminating book on Josie Mpama, but no single book or article yet explores the topic of women and communism in South Africa, and this is particularly true for the exile period. My interest today is to ask what we could gain from considering the history of women in the party in exile, beyond simply acknowledgement of the fact that women were there. So I therefore propose two possible avenues of exploration for this question. First, I want to suggest that in tracking women's personal writings about the Soviet Union, we can gain new appreciation of the place of the Soviet Union in party members' thought and practice. Complicated analyses that have focused either on the assumed negative attributes of the Soviet Union or narrowly on the formal sphere of official political influence. And secondly, more practically, I want to talk about a daycare program which the ANC and SACP tried to run in exile, and what that tells us about party influence on everyday matters in exile life and about theories of women's rights in exile. So first, a small number of prominent ANC women who were also SACP members traveled frequently to the Soviet Union during early years of exile, mainly in the 1960s and 1970s. Florence Mopolsho and Ruth Mompati were two such women. Both were high-ranking members of the ANC throughout the exile period, both sitting on the ANC's National Executive Committee at different moments. They were also SACP members. They played a significant role in ANC diplomacy, both taking a turn representing the ANC at the left-wing women's organization, the Women's International Democratic Federation, which was based in East Berlin, and they traveled to many international conferences and events. We're lucky to have access to their impressions because of letters they exchanged with their friend and comrade, Ray Alexander Simons, whose archive provides almost unparalleled access to the work and thought of these Black women SACP members who did not otherwise leave many written or personal records. So how did Ruth Mompati and Florence Mopolsho render the Soviet Union in their letters to their friend and colleague? Outside of South Africa, there's been a recent and renewed scholarly attention to the inspiration that the Soviet Union provided to activists around the world in the context of decolonization movements. Scholars have emphasized the important inspiration that activists derive from travels to the Soviet Union and connection with activists there. With regards to South Africa, Chris Lee's recent work on Alex Laguma has similarly drawn attention to the importance of the Soviet Union for opening a space of theorization for ANC and SACP members to think their struggles in dialogue with other anti-colonial movements. But for these South African women, I want to argue we can read the Soviet Union as occupying a different space. Rather than a space of fantasy or inspiration as such, Mompati and Mopolsho more commonly rendered the Soviet Union as a taken for granted space of quotidian care. First, it's a therapeutic space. The women mention illness frequently, with Soviet medical regimes attracting much notice. Ruth Mompati wryly explained a long delay in correspondence with a description of Soviet attention to her health. I quote, she wrote, "When I left Lusaka, I was coughing, and by the time I reached Moscow, I was coughing like a horse, and you know it's a mistake to be unwell there. The long and the short of it is that instead of being there for 4 days, I'm only now on my way to Lusaka. I had bronchitis and they wouldn't rest until they satisfied themselves that I'll live, which I always think is very nice of them. Moposho, who suffered from chronic ailments which would eventually contribute to her early death in 1985, made frequent mention of visits to the Soviet Union for medical treatment. From the 1960s onwards, she complained of ailments to her knees and stomach and mentioned frequent visits to the Soviet Union for medical care. When she was in Morogoro, Tanzania, and still unwell, she received support from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Women's Committee sent her medication. Another time, Moposho described almost fleeing the Soviet Union, her flight booking home being contingent on completing a medical exam. She reported to Simons that, quote, most unceremoniously, I was made aware that I've been booked provisionally in case I don't get through with my medical checkup. I only had a few minutes to prepare. The doctor, she reported, was rather fed up that I couldn't be hospitalized, but it was out of the question because I'd made no arrangements. If I know the Soviets well, they would have kept me for months. Holidays appear as well, usually in the Soviet Union or other countries within its orbit. Writing to her friend Ray Simons, Mompati warmly implored Simons to request a holiday at the Black Sea, quoting Lenin to remind her, and I quote, Lenin said the life of a revolutionary doesn't belong to him but to the masses, the people. So he or she has a duty to look after his health so as to be able to continue the revolution. In Mompati's opinion, Simons was working too hard and needed a holiday which the Soviet allies could provide. At other times, Moposho as well mentioned upcoming holidays in Hungary or the Soviet Union. Mompati and Moposho navigated a fine dance with Soviet support, seeking medical diagnosis and treatment, but lightheartedly trying to dodge the rigors of Soviet medicine and the confinement it at times demanded. Contrary to more poetic readings of Cold War Soviet journeys, or even the more celebratory letters provided by earlier South African activist travelers like Lillian Ngoyi, Mompati and Moposho, and Simons as well in her responses, trace a more utilitarian imaginary. At other times, the Soviet Union's policies were merely sources of annoyance. Moposho described the aggravation of indirect transit, with the ANC dependent on Soviet generosity and providing tickets and therefore dependent on Soviet transit routes, meaning ANC members had to travel to African countries via Moscow. Moposho wrote once, and I quote, I'm in Dar on transit to Benin. Very reluctantly, I've been appointed by the NEC to attend the presidium meeting of the Afro-Asian Solidarity Organization. I'm only hoping that we don't get the ticket as usually expected by the Soviets, which means I have to travel by Aeroflot to Moscow and back to Africa, something that gives me a nightmare. Describing the potential trajectory from Tanzania to Moscow, then south again to Benin, Moposho grimly envisages a long and exhausting journey. The quotidian and even banal Soviet Union with its demanding doctors and frustrating airlines replaced any dream world or utopia. Instead, tracing the losses and hopes of these letters, it's possible to argue that for these women correspondents, the Soviet Union was not a fantasy, but rather the condition of possibility for the aspiration they held, the orientation towards a free South Africa, a home to return to. The Soviet Union was taken for granted, the necessary precondition for a new world in which they had to believe. Attending to this dimension reminds us of just how important the Soviet Union was as the apparent guarantee of the possibility of transformation, unromanticized because it was so thoroughly relied upon. But the practical inspiration and support that the Soviet Union offered was significant as well. And here I want to turn to my second example, one of very practical programming in the day-to-day life of exile. While previous works have focused more on high-level connections between the Soviet Union, the SACP, and the ANC, I want to argue that we should pay more attention to the everyday influences of communist thought and practice within the South African exile community, relayed via party members. A salient example is the daycare programs that the ANC tried to develop in the late 1970s as its exile membership grew following the Soweto uprisings of 1976. In this period, thousands of young people left South Africa, and many of these people joined the ANC. Most were then sent to the ANC community in Morogoro. Soon there were several thousand young South Africans living there, including many with children. For the first time, the ANC found itself confronting the question of how to care for and support young people who were quite dependent on the organization for basic needs. Among other ideas, one thing that was proposed was a series of daycares to be built to provide for all children born into the ANC. I've written about these daycares previously as an ANC program, but in fact, it's quite clear that they were established initially by people who were members of the SACP and who were inspired directly by experiences that they'd had in the Soviet Union and other Eastern Bloc countries and by socialist feminism. For example, most of the research for the initial daycare plan was conducted by Spencer Hodgson, an SACP member, who was, I think, is the son of longtime party stalwarts Jack and Rika Hodgson. In a 1979 report he presented to the ANC Women section members, Hodgson outlined his rationale for the daycares, writing, and I quote, "In the West, daycares are comparatively unknown. The rich employ a childminder or nanny. Working class women must resign themselves to several years of confinement, often in high-rise buildings. The loss of women's earnings, coupled with her lonely existence and often the chauvinistic attitude of her partner, result in unhappiness and often social problems, such as child battery, shoplifting, etc. The decision of the ANC to provide facilities which completely free its female members for the fulfillment of their revolutionary role is correct, and in view of the difficulties involved, is indicative of the importance that the ANC attaches to the question of women's participation in the struggle. If the institution is to be revolutionary and a prototype for a new South Africa, it should not be regarded simply as a play school where parents can deposit their children," end quote. SACP members continued to play an active role in organizing these daycares throughout the late 70s and early 1980s, including, in fact, Florence Moposho, whom I mentioned previously. Longtime Communist Party Violet Weinberg, despite being quite elderly by this point, was present at many meetings and discussed the daycares with visitors from Poland and the GDR, seeking advice on how to run them. In the early 1980s, party members reported on offers to train childcare experts in the GDR to work in the daycares. While in fact, this program never succeeded tremendously, and we can't say that it provided inspiration in the post-apartheid South Africa as some had hoped, the effort to generate a powerful daycare program nevertheless demonstrates the quotidian inspiration that Soviet and Eastern Bloc policies offered. The SACP, and most particularly, though not exclusively, women in the SACP, were the link whereby these programs came to be shaped. I think it's important too to challenge the assumption that this was just a situation of women being relegated to dealing with childcare. Yes, it's fair to say that there was an element of that in that it was the women's section of the ANC who was asked to provide these programs. But the influence of the SACP and the ambitions of the program alert us that this program was something more important as well. It was an effort to reshape relationships between men and women and to explicitly challenge the idea that women should have children and leave the workforce, an idea that was in common currency in many places in the world in the early 1980s. So these two examples represent very different ways into the question of women, gender, and the SACP in exile. Taken together, I want to suggest that women communists in the party relied on the Soviet Union for support and care, as well as for practical inspiration. The Soviet Union, via the party, offered not an imagined or distant site of inspiration, but an ordinary example of how life could be. Women in the party took seriously the promises of socialism. In conclusion, I think we enrich our understandings of the party itself when we acknowledge that women were among its leadership and arguably played a significant role in managing relationships, not just with other communist parties or national governments, but also with left-wing organizations like the Women's International Democratic Federation. Following on this, I think we enrich our understandings of the exile period more broadly when we pay attention to the everyday commitments to socialism lived out within the movements. Attending to women's practical work offers one way to see this, one way in. Moreover, it's interesting to note or consider the erasure of these women as members of the Communist Party. What would it mean to remember Ruth Mompati and Florence Moposho, among others, as members of the party rather than primarily as ANC members? On the other hand, it's hard to escape the fact that explicit women and gender issues were not an overwhelming priority for the party, including for the women within it. The engagement of women in the liberation movements has often been debated in the context of women's relationship to the national question. I wonder what we could gain if we try to theorize women's engagements and wider gender debates through the lens of socialist feminism, rather than either nationalist or liberal feminism, particularly when we write and think from a moment today where the pitfalls of liberal feminism are only too clear. And I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Fascinating presentation. It's interesting to speak about the meaning of Soviet Union to the high-ranking female women in the ANC in exile. I hope that we'll get more questions later on. And then our next speaker will be Hilary Lynd. The title of her presentation is Living, okay, finished right on time, Rachel. The title of the paper is Living Together, the SACP, the ANC-SACP Alliance, the Soviet Union, and the National Question. Just quickly go through her short bio. Hilary is a PhD candidate in South Africa and Soviet history at the University of California, Berkeley, and a visiting researcher at the Wits History Workshop. She is a historian of South Africa and the Soviet Union / Russia with particular interest in comparative empire and decolonization, ideologies of racial and ethnic difference, global socialism and capitalism, area studies, and the international circulation of people, ideas, and arms. She is currently completing a dissertation that focuses on the political and intellectual history of connections between South Africa and the Soviet Union before, during, and after the simultaneous collapse of apartheid and socialism. Her most recent publication is titled The Peace Deal, the formation of the Ingonyama Trust and the IP decision to join South Africa's 1994 elections, 2021 publication. Hilary, you have 15 minutes. You can start.
I want to say thanks so much to the organizers of this series and of this panel, and also to my other panelists. And I have to say, I'm so pleased, by the way, that this paper builds off of arguments and insights from Rachel's. So yeah, feels wonderful and daunting to be in such company. So I'm going to talk today about the relationship between the Soviet Union, the SACP, and the ANC. And in particular, I want to discuss some assumptions about that relationship that have taken hold and hung on for many decades. In a lot of ways, they've seemed so obvious that they haven't usually surfaced as problems for researchers. So that cluster of assumptions goes something like this. And these are unfair generalizations, but if you'll permit me, this is a sort of brute version of it. So it goes, the Soviet Union promoted a universalist and colorblind Marxism-Leninism that relentlessly prioritized class as the basic category of struggle and analysis. In that economistic approach, the idea was more or less that if you abolished capitalism, you'd automatically destroy racism. It wasn't good at thinking about race as anything other than a tool of the ruling class to divide workers. When the ANC started working with the SACP in the 50s, and even more so, when the ANC and SACP built ties with the Soviet Union in the early 60s, these were imagined to be the poles of political contention, communists working closely with Moscow, pulling the alliance towards Marxist universalism, and Africanists pulling in the opposite direction towards African nationalism. So I come to this material from a bit of an unusual perspective. I've been trained in Soviet as well as South African history. And I spent 8 months doing archival research in Russia, as well as over a year in South Africa, where I am now. And in the sources I collected, I didn't see that cluster of assumptions borne out. So the Soviet Union in the 60s, 70s, and 80s was a highly contradictory place. It was a conservative and routinized society that was speaking slogans of revolution. It was a superpower dependent on foreign grain imports to feed its population. And it was an anti-imperial society built out of the carcass of the Russian Empire. Most importantly for this paper, Soviet theory and practice had a really serious interest in ethnicity, in language and culture, in the deep histories and political personalities of groups that Anglophone Marxism during the Cold War did not. Through its long existence, the Soviet state nurtured quite a few nationalists and repressed quite a few universalists. It said the goal was to create a politics that was national in form, socialist in content. But the difference between form and content was never that easy to judge. And the distinction between national and social usually got less important the further you went away from Moscow, as long as there was some reason to choose the side of revolution. Soviet nationalities policy has never been especially important to historians of the South African left. but I think that it should be because it was part of the history of the South African left. It wasn't a primary concern for most white communists, but many revolutionaries of color took seriously the Soviet blueprint for turning a history of empire inside out, for living together in a way that neither dissolved nor pathologized difference. That model had a troubled history, to be sure, in some ways that South Africans noticed, and in some ways they did not. So after the Bolsheviks came to power in 1917, they stretched their revolutionary ambition across an enormous landmass that was home to people of remarkable ethnic, linguistic, and religious diversity. They faced what Lenin called the objective reality of the existence of nations. And the new socialist state had to find a way to understand nations and to manage them. So what started as a play to attract non-Russian nationalities grew into an attempt to promote a novel and anti-imperialist form of a multinational society. The idea was to depoliticize national culture by encouraging it to flourish. The destination was the fusion of all kinds of different people in an integrated socialist society, and the path to get there required acknowledging national grievances. Viewed in a positive light, which is often how South Africans looked at it, Soviet nationalities policy was different from the particularism of apartheid in its commitment to mobility, mixing, and merging. But it was also different from liberal universalism in the emphasis it placed on cultural difference and affirmative action for formerly oppressed peoples. In 1927, when the list of nationalities of the USSR was finalized, it included 172 that were entitled to state resources for native language education, national newspapers and publishing houses, support for national arts, literature, music, and dance. Under the program of indigenization, Turianitsa, those from nationalities considered oppressed received favored access to higher education and favored promotion in party, state, and factory bodies. In the mid-1930s, Stalin's government backed off of the radicalism of the early period and rehabilitated Russian nationalism to a significant extent. The number of nationalities recognized by the state was reduced, but those that made the cut, and especially those that got status as republics, had significant privileges within their own little ethnic compartments. Over the lifespan of the Soviet state, Soviet nationalities policy went through quite a few transformations, but there are two central tensions that never went away. The first was between the politics of sameness and difference. The Soviet state had impulses to homogenize and particularize that shifted across time and space in unpredictable, disorienting, and often seriously dangerous ways. The second tension was an uneasy overlap between what was particularly Russian and what was universally Soviet. Ethnic Russians were the dominant nationality, but also formally anonymous in the institutional landscape of the Soviet multi-ethnic society. They didn't have Russia-specific institutions like other nationalities did. Russian was the unmarked default in public life. We might think of similarities to English here in post-apartheid South Africa. The Soviet state expected everyone but Russians to be bilingual. Russian was the language of inter-ethnic communication, of high culture, and of upward mobility. In the early 60s especially, the Soviet state celebrated the imminent arrival of a new kind of historical community, the Soviet people, the Sovietsky Narod, that was multi-ethnic, egalitarian, and united under socialism. That enthusiasm generally got weaker in the next decades, but officials kept talking about the Sovietsky Narod right up until the beginning of the end in the late 1980s. So multiple generations of anti-imperialist activists looked to Soviet nationalities policy for inspiration. Famous Black travelers to the Soviet Union like W.E.B. Du Bois, Langston Hughes, Paul Robeson, Walter Rodney, Gugi wa Thiong'o, all directed particular attention to the Soviet multinational society, the way it handled language, culture, and imperial legacies of conquest and underdevelopment. George Padmore was a Black socialist from Trinidad who was expelled from the Comintern in 1934 for taking the wrong approach to the national question. But even after he rejected Soviet foreign policy, he wrote about Soviet nationalities policy as a model for anti-imperialists everywhere. In his 1946 book, How Russia Transformed Her Colonial Empire, Padmore argued that the Soviet Union's greatest achievement was, quote, the fraternal collaboration of the world's most heterogeneous population. Looking forward to the end of the British and French empires, Padmore argued that national independence would preserve existing inequality, while a multinational federation would transform it. He used the Soviet Union as a precedent for radically transforming an unequal relationship between colonizer and colonized. Liberation required a scale bigger than the nation state. The exploiters owed more to the exploited than cutting them loose and granting them formal independence. But dreams of non-national forms of liberation on the African continent remained just that, dreams. The process of decolonization produced a pattern where ostensible nation states became ostensibly independent. The new orthodoxy assumed a natural passage out of empire that meant breaking ties with the metropole and claiming national sovereignty. That model seemed to work for the national elites of many independent African countries. But both the ANC-SACP alliance and the Soviet Union had an awkward relationship to that new orthodoxy. Both were committed in different ways to the eventual cohabitation of colonizer and colonized. And though the details remained fuzzy, Congress visions of post-apartheid society always assumed that the African majority would inherit both the economic apparatus of domination and the community of white beneficiaries. So what to do? Was it possible to undo an unequal relationship among sections of the population in a way that eliminated the inequality, but not the relationship? There weren't many examples of societies that had ever tried, but the Soviet Union was one. So I'll restrict my South African examples here to just two. In 1953, Walter Sisulu and Duma Nokwe visited the Soviet Union as part of an extended international trip. And in Moscow, Nokwe gave a speech in English. Sisulu remembered years later, quote, "The interpreters were disappointed. The address was supposed to have been given in Xhosa and interpreted into Russian according to a text already prepared. They thought that speaking in English was a reflection of acceptance of white domination." Sisulu and Nokwe asked to see Moscow, Leningrad, and Stalingrad, but as was common, standard for visitors from the colonized world, their hosts arranged instead for them to visit one of the former colonial areas of the Soviet Union. They went to Azerbaijan. It seems that 2 weeks in Azerbaijan made quite an impression. What they saw, Sisulu wrote, quote, "convinced us that the development of the former backwards areas inhabited by the minorities is one of the most remarkable achievements of modern times." Sisulu wrote that the Soviet nationalities policy was a two-pronged assault on economic and cultural underdevelopment. And on his return to South Africa, he joined the party. 2 decades later, in the 1970s, Alex Laguma traveled across the Soviet Union. And he wrote about the Soviet friendship of the peoples, as it was called, distinctly as the opposite of apartheid. He consistently focused attention on the national question, on how human difference should be organized in a post-imperial society. I quote, "We all wanted to see this wonder of the world. The Soviet Union is a multinational state. It is populated by more than 100 large and small nationalities. Soviet experience in creating a multinational socialist state and grappling by common effort with a complex national question has won world recognition and the attention of all those who still seek the answer to such questions." Laguma's experience of the Soviet Union was colored by his interest in cultural difference and relations among groups. He wanted to know, were Russians oppressing Tajiks? Did Uzbeks have opportunities to escape poverty? How did people of different nationalities talk to each other? Did they marry each other? He loved the ancient ethnic histories that his hosts told him, the national customs they performed, the indigenous foods they served him. He was always watching out for signs of what he took to be healthy coexistence. Like many South African visitors, Laguma looked for what he longed for in his home country. This paper can only scratch the surface of a complex set of issues, but there's one major point to take away, which is that it doesn't work to extrapolate from the categories and chronologies of Anglophone Marxism to describe Soviet society or even Soviet ideology. I think we can do better than to treat Soviet influence as a bundle of Marxist-Leninist abstractions And above all, it's time to discard the idea that the Soviet Union ignored or minimized ethnic, cultural, or even racial difference. The history of how the Soviet Union dealt with difference within its borders had moments of optimism about affirmative action and ethnic integration, as well as paranoia, persecution, and deeply essentialist ways of thinking about culture and groups. Taking seriously both that history and the ways it was refracted through the perceptions and experiences of South Africans who spent time in the Soviet Union adds a new and I think necessary dimension to old debates about nationalism, communism, and the struggle against apartheid. I will stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Hilary. That was very interesting, especially the problem, the tension around sameness and difference. That's very interesting. And then we'll go to our last panelist, Vladimir, Shubin, and Daria. Let me be careful here so that I don't butcher your surname. Turianitsa. I hope I got it right. Their paper is titled Moscow and the SACP. Shubin is a professor, is a principal research fellow at the Institute for African Studies, Russian Academy of Sciences, and research fellow at the Center for Military Studies, Stellenbosch University. He is a Doctor of Science in History degree from the Moscow State University and a PhD degree from University of Western Cape, an honorary degree. Before joining the academia, he was involved in the political and practical support for the liberation struggle in Africa. Apart from Soviet/Russian state awards, he was bestowed with the South African Order of Companions of O.R. Tambo Silva for excellent contribution to struggle against apartheid and colonialism in Africa, in Southern Africa. In 2008, he published a book entitled The Hot Cold War, the USSR in Southern Africa. And his co-presenter is Daria. Daria is a junior research fellow in the Institute for African Studies, Russian Academy of Sciences. She attended Moscow State University from 2012 to 2018, where she received her bachelor's and master's degrees in Asian and African studies and developed a strong interest in South African history. She speaks English, Afrikaans, and a bit of Swahili as her minor. Currently as a part of the research team, Daria is working on the joint Russian-South African project called International Solidarity and Struggles Against Apartheid, Historical Memories in South Africa and Russia. And she's pursuing her PhD degree in Contemporary History of South Africa. She most recently published Patricia de Lille Victories and Masculinations in the Career of a Colored Politician in South Africa, a 2020 publication. Shubin and Daria, I think we can start now. After 15 minutes, probably going to 20 minutes. We'll see how it goes.
Okay. Now you hear me, yeah? Sorry, do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. So to begin with, if everything goes all right, because there are more and more restrictions caused by COVID-19, but we hope to leave Moscow on November 13th, 4 of us, including Daria and myself, to spend about 15 days in South Africa. So while greeting all participants, I hope that those who are in South Africa now, we hope to meet again there. We'll spend some time mostly in Tshwane, in Gauteng, and then in Cape Town as usually. I cannot think about visiting South Africa without calling on Cape Town. This is point number one. Point number two, it's very important to study Russian. Hilary, I would be happy to say, Dr. Lynd, I hope soon I will be in a position to say, Hilary's privilege is enormous because she speaks very good Russian, she reads Russian, and therefore, of course, it's not the only reason, but very important reason of high quality of her research, especially as distinct from many, many others. I'll give you one example. We were invited to take part in some webinars at SAIA, South African Institute of International Affairs, because they started a 2-year project on Russia. But nobody in this project reads or speaks Russian. So from the very beginning, I think it hardly be successful. Okay, now to the subject of our presentation. We agreed with Daria, I will speak on say something general, and then on the first part of existence of our archives, and she will speak about the present situation, a bit more optimistic maybe that I think about it. So, if to discuss Moscow and South African Communist parties, I mean the first one, I don't speak about minor groups, I mean the Communist Party of South Africa and say South African Communist Party, we should divide it in 2 parts. The first part, when this side and our side were members of the Comintern. You remember at that stage, all parties were regarded as sections of the international organizations. And not only in the communist movement, because those who study Western Europe, I'm sure you remember this abbreviation SFIO, Section Française de l'International, sorry for my French, de l'Internationale Ouvrière, that's social French section of the Workers' International, meaning Second International, and only much later, on the verge of 1970s, it became officially even another party, French Socialist Party. So this is the first time. So that history, before the disbanding of the Communist International, ought to be maybe more practical before the World War II, is one. And the second history started much later, because as we know, from the mid 1942, I believe, the Russian mission consulate was established. It does not mean there were contacts established between the Communist Party in South Africa and Communist Party in Moscow. Practically, whatever contacts existed, they went via London, via British, to be exact, via Communist Party of Great Britain. Some South African communists used to come to Moscow even after the dissolution or forced dissolution of the party. For example, Brian Bunting and so on, at first. And I discussed with some of them, and particularly with Bunting, they haven't got any mission to contact with the Soviet communists. They were there as the guest of our cultural society, of contacts with foreign countries. The only person, judging by the archives, who mentioned this point was Sam Khan. You remember Sam Khan was the man who was, as a member of parliament, announced in parliament at 1950 the dissolution of the party. But by that time, Sam Khan lived in London. He did not take part in recreation or reforming of the Communist Party inside the country. Therefore, when he came, there was no sense for the representatives of the Russian Soviet Communist Party to discuss this very matter with him. And the real process of establishing contact started in 1960. In 1960, the letter came signed by John Golland. John Golland was the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Great Britain, when he recommended to receive in Moscow Vela Pillai. Vela Pillai, late Vela Pillai, I'm sure you know this name, of course. He was at that time representative of the Communist Party of South Africa in the West and Europe, especially in Britain. And for me, it's still a puzzle, you see. In John Golland letter, officially, maybe there were some other communications as well, only his name was mentioned. But in July 1960, he came together with Yusuf Dada. And of course, more discussions or more serious discussions took place with Yusuf Dada. who was the chairperson of the party, at least before he left for Exile and became chairperson again later, chairman. That time we were not politically correct, everybody knows. Yeah, and but at that stage, there was no yet talk about the armed struggle, any kind of this resolute struggle. Mostly there were discussions about some political literature, general discussions about world situation of the world communist movement, and the question of financial situation was also touched upon, you see. Yusuf Dadu, he explained the situation in the party inside the country because of the repressions is very difficult to get some funding. Apparently, the British party did support them, that was appreciated. And from this point, certain financial assistance started coming from Moscow. But I was to underline, I wrote the details in my book on the ANC, which was published twice in South Africa, so you can check it there. But the main point that, at least officially, and initially it was practically so too, the money did not come from the Soviet Union. The money came from international trade union fund or foundation for support of left movements. And officially, initially, it started in Bucharest in Romania, as complicated as this. But detail in my book, I don't want to go there. Several socialist countries contributed, including China, but in early 60s, Chinese withdrew from it for obvious reasons. And then maybe more, initially just a bit more than 50% were from the Soviet Union, but then this percentage rose. But that's another story. Again, the details partly are covered in my book. Now, for the first 2 or 3 years, 2.5, the contacts between Moscow and South African Liberation Movement were mostly with the Communist Party. There were 1, 2 maybe persons from the ANC who came, but the main visit of the ANC leadership came in 1963 in April, when Oliver Tambo came, accompanied, by the way, by Moses Katana, who, as we all know, was General Secretary of the party. But in this period, before 1960, there were already discussions about the armed struggle, about further financial support. If you look at the figures are rather big, but it's clear why, because the money through the party went to the ANC as MK especially, including people say that famous Lilius Lee farm, I don't know if it's correct or not, but definitely financial support was there. And military struggle started. Military training started with some groups in 1963, but I cannot exclude that maybe certain individuals came early as well, because unfortunately not much information is available in the archives. And late 63, early 64, a big group of people came to Odessa, but Daria will speak more about it. That group included some leaders of the ANC and the Communist Party. And then most of the support went directly to the ANC. As far as the party is concerned, I mean the Communist Party, there were additional training in the, what your people call usually Lenin School. Lenin School was, how to say, I don't like the word secret, but close, we call it, name, but officially it was Institute for Social Studies, Institute of Social Studies. And by the way, we published a good article in our magazine, but in English, by Tshepo, by Sufficient Law, who is our counterpart in our joint project, when he quotes a lot from Thabo Mbeki about his experience at this Institute of Social Studies. I think it's very important what Mbeki said there. It was not pure political. There was a good opportunity there for people to enrich themselves in culture. For example, he recalls how he read in translation to English the famous poem by a Georgian poet, Rustaveli, the Knight in the Tiger Skin. That's just one of the examples. Now, I don't want to go into details all this versatile cooperation. I don't like the word assistance, but say cooperation, which was there. Practically, it was parallel to the ANC, and a lot was done with the participation of communists who came as the ANC there. This is the number one. Number two is the period, unfortunately. Yeah, sorry. I should explain where is my information coming. There were some archives in the Communist Party after these tragic events in 1991. Early 1992, a new organization was formed called the Center for Storage of Contemporary Documentation. And fortunately, I had a chance to work there before I left for Cape Town in early '93. A lot of information was there, and I was naive. I thought that those papers, those documents which I could not see, I will see when I come back. But when I came back, practically all of these documents were sealed. Of course, the only exception was so-called collection number 89, when the different area documents were collected there from several organizations, especially from the party archives, when there was a case against unlawful banning of the Communist Party by Boris Yeltsin, but I don't want to go to all details there. And unfortunately, up to the recent period, until say last 5 years, interrupted by some technical movement of these archives from one place to another, and of course by pandemic, nothing was open. Now the process started and going well, but Daria will tell more about it. The second source, of course, the oral history. The third source, very close connected with, is the memoirs. And here we have problems. As you know, oral history, initially not much has been done. Memoirs, not much. Practically it was Ronnie Kasser's book published, if my memory serves me well, in '93. And what was her name? Magdalene, yeah? The Hesher widow's book, you see. By the way, again, when we read the memoirs, we must be careful. Sometimes people make genuine mistakes. Some people, what they call it, omission. For example, Hesher's widow does not mention that she joined Makivan as others, as what in the ANC language, political language, was called the Gang of A. Too strong maybe point, but it's there. But no mention of this book, of this fact in her book, etc., etc. On the other side, very often people just, their memory is not serving them too well. But anyhow, this is very precious. Unfortunately, people are leaving this world. As you know, many good people left nothing. Nothing.
Shubin,
So,
excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt
yeah.
you. You left with about 30 seconds, and you
No,
still have Daria.
But don't forget about, no problem. I'm finishing. I'm just trying to say that we must mobilize as much as possible to help people to write their memoirs while they're still here. My last example, maybe, speaking of our people, the first 4 persons who were with Tshepo in Angola, all of them no more. I mean, the heads of group. And even of the military, of the ANC group, first 2 persons also no more. Thank you. Please, Daria, sorry for taking your time. Dash.
Yeah, I will continue our joint report. So I will speak mostly about the documents and resources which I use for my work from the Russian State Archive of Modern History, or how it's called, Organium. As Professor Shubin noted, that despite the pandemic, the materials from archives concerning the International Department of CPSU Central Committee continue to unclassify, and the new inventions appear. And I was trying to work with them, and until recently, the documents were limited till 1976, according to my work in 2020. But from 2020 now, the documents concerning the period from 1979, 1980s appeared. So for this work, I was using the documents from the period of 1975 and 1976 were used for this presentation, and some of them from the early period. So for the special importance from the history of Moscow cooperation with ANC and SAPC is one of the detailed 15-page report of the studies of the second group of Umkhonto we fighters in Odessa, Higher Combined Court Red Banner College. Written by its commander, it was sent to the International Department in 1965. Unlike the cadets of the 1964 enrollment, that is the first group that included future political figures of the ANC, for example, and SAPC, Moses Madiba, Ronnie Carsley, Joe Madise. The cadets of the second group, which they are quoting in the documents, were politically less developed and less active. They exercise caution in their speeches in political education classes. At the same time, the document also mentions that there were almost no cases when the cadets openly and actively defended the views of the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. When discussing the issue of the modern international communist movement, the students of the last year did. And to compare with the first group, there were cases of manifestations of hostility to each other and to the host. And some students were rude towards staff and commanders. So it's just to show how there were some difficulties. And just to show that the second group was really different from the first one, they show that the group was quite mature, that out of 163 people, 79 were 25, 30, 34 years old, and 10 people were among 30s, and one cadet was 57 years old. Another important level of understanding this group was the level of education, that only 6 of them finished 12 classes and 30 people were completely illiterate. The work with these specific students were carried out according to a specific method that the 5 groups of educational process was organized with double translation from Russian into English and from English to the national language, native language. The state of military discipline, according to the Soviet military, on the whole can be assessed as satisfactory. In conclusion, the document states that most of the cadets understand the purpose of their stay in the USSR. Nevertheless, it was advisable, in the opinion of the command of Odessa College, to inform the leadership about the need for more careful selection for sending to the USSR. Another important source of understanding the interaction between the Soviet Union and SAPC were numerous recordings of conversations between party representatives and the Soviet diplomatic officials. Sometimes it was called exchange of opinions. Some of these conversations were held in Soviet embassies, mainly in Tanzania and Zambia, for instance. It should be said that these meetings were discussions or dialogues with Soviet interlocutors in confidence. For example, during such conversations, the issues of attitude of the national liberation movement in Southern Africa was discussed, and the comrades of SAPC told how they were worried about this issue. This was due to the activities of some African countries, including Tanzania and Zambia, which made attempts to establish a dialogue with South African governments. An illustrative example of the cooling of relations between the ANC and Tanzania was the fact that for almost a year, Oliver Tambo was not able to have an appointment with President Nyerere, according to the document. In 1965, these documents showed that the chair of SAPC, Yusuf Dado, described their relation with Tanzania, citing that they are looking warm, but not more. The Tanzanian side is not so much hostile as Zambia. At the same document, he says, confirming his words, we must rely only on ourselves, not counting on substantial assistance from African countries. Some of other discussed topics in these documents were relations between the ANC and PAC, discussions of political prisoners in South Africa, how the struggle against the regime in South Africa was intensified inside of the country. To sum up, the Soviet leadership attentively listened to the assessments of the members of SAPC and ANC and the positions of other countries regarding the national liberation movements in other countries, which helped the Soviet side to determine their trajectories. Finally, I would say that the Organi is the researcher-friendly institution which helps scholarships to allow and to make copies of the documents, and you can receive advice from their archivists. So I will finish here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Daria and Shubin. An interesting presentation. Because we're quickly running out of time, I'll just ask Alex to give us his reflections on the presentations made by our panelists. But quickly, Alex is a professor in the Department of History, an adjunct professor in the Department of American Studies in Indiana University, and an editor of the American Historical Review. He studies the intersection of labor history and the struggle for racial justice in societies shaped by white supremacy, particularly the U.S. South, and the 20th century South Africa. His first book, Twice the Welcome, no, got it wrong. Twice
you know what,
Welcome.
Tshepo, let's just
Neighbor.
skip it. I
No.
don't need an introduction. I really
No.
want to jump into my comments because I want to
Yeah.
make sure people have time. Let me just suffice it to say, to the degree that I have expertise in South African history, it really focuses on the Black trade union movement. So so let me actually begin with something of a disclaimer as well, or a warning. My own introduction to South African history and my knowledge of it at least began at the feet of Martin Legasek, okay? And while I can't say I share all of Martin's views about the SACP, as most of you know, he was an uncompromising critic of the SACP from an anti-Stalinist or a Trotskyist perspective. So that's something of a warning about at least what's partly shaped my perspective. So let me begin. First of all, I found all of these papers just fascinating. I learned a lot. I really enjoyed them. Let me begin with Patrick. So Patrick asked to what extent we should understand CPSA pre-1960 ideas as permeating larger popular consciousness in South Africa, in distinction from its self-proclaimed vanguard role in leading the masses in the anti-apartheid movement. In other words, I think his paper asks, as do many of these papers, how we can go beyond party history to a history of the party in South African society and culture. Patrick asserts that even, or in fact, indeed, especially after the party suppression, the ideas of the CP began to permeate South African society more broadly. But that's a somewhat different assertion than the ideas of the SACP, its philosophy and beliefs, as he said, were to greatly influence the strategic line that shaped the ANC's approach to the armed struggle after 1960. But one shouldn't conflate those two, right? That is clearly the latter statement, that the SACP shaped the approach to the armed struggle, is true. The degree to which its ideas permeated beyond the ranks of the cadres, not necessarily. I'm not convinced anyway. I would like to see more evidence of that. In fact, it may be that when the party turned to armed struggle, as someone like Martin would have argued, it actually perhaps reduced the influence of its ideas in day-to-day struggle. I certainly argue that that's the case in the trade unions. I would certainly agree that both strategy and tactics in the MK drew from or were dictated by, depending on one's point of view, CP expertise. But as Jeremy Cronin observed yesterday during the launch of Tom Lodge's book, I can't tell if Jeremy's still on or not, what we really needed to do is examine the history in that space between the Moscow made them do it school of Ellis and Johnson and pretending that everything that the ANC did right was due solely to the unerring wisdom of the party, right? What we need to do is chart a middle ground between those two views, which I think the papers here all do. Either way, in the case of MK, what did party influence actually mean? In other words, SACP comrades had certain ideas about armed struggle, gleaned from theory, observation, training abroad, underground experience perhaps, but what were these ideas and how were they applied specifically to South African conditions? Were they Cuban or Vietnamese, Soviet or Chinese? 1960, as you all know, was a moment in the communist world in which there was no longer a unified theory, even amongst communists, about how to proceed with third world revolution, right? The Soviet model was suddenly being challenged by many other sources. Mangashe certainly alludes to these potential sources, Vietnam, but does little to specify, disaggregate, or chart them, at least in this paper. The initial commitment to sabotage, for example, where did that come? Where did that come from? Mangashe is excellent, I think, on the materiel aspect, i.e. the AK. But what about ideology? The AK, by the way, I think is a very interesting thing to look at because, of course, it had ideological and cultural significance as much as military significance. And Patrick alludes to that, and I would love to hear more about that. But it certainly wasn't merely a piece of military hardware. It became a propaganda weapon and a cultural prop, both within struggle and in solidarity movements. Finally, if the political language of armed struggle was drawn from the USSR, especially its World War II experience, which of course wasn't all that distant in 1960, what were the implications of that? Was it Stalingrad, or was it rather partisan warfare in occupied Europe? A much better source of experience, especially for something like sabotage campaigns. I mean, in very practical terms, maybe Shubin can answer this. I would assume that the people training ANC cadres in the Soviet bloc in the early 60s were people who had, helped train partisan saboteurs 20 years before. I haven't already gone 15 minutes, have I? Not possible. I'm also curious about how non-racialism was promoted in the ranks. What specifically was the pedagogy used to combat tendencies of ethnic nationalism? Mangashe concludes that the failures of MK can also be attributed to those of the party, an important insight, I think, and we can't continue to say, if only the party had not done so-and-so, things would have worked out. Its failures and contributions were part of a unity. Rachel Sandwell's paper, I think, goes right at the heart of the contradiction between party as theory and party as lived experience, but from a very different angle, observing how the women question looked eastward with ambivalence, even while drawing very creatively on socialist models of childcare under actually existing socialism, with some success. In the latter case, Sandwell is very attentive to the dialectic at play, namely that the socialist bloc provided inspiration, but was certainly not imposed on ANC exile formations to court by any means, right? Still, this represented, quote, an effort to implement a program that would reshape relations between men and women and explicitly challenge the idea that women should have children and leave the workforce. The Soviet bloc, however, at the time remained quite wanting when it came to cultivating female political leadership, I think. As Hilary notes, the Soviet Union in this era was in fact a very conservative, socially conservative society, and this surely extended to gender roles. Rachel offers careful readings of the ambivalence that appears in the correspondence of party women as they look to the USSR for inspiration, but more in terms of practical medical diagnosis and treatment. Although I'm not sure how lighthearted their efforts, their comments actually were about the rigors of Soviet medicine, confinement, and treatment. Rachel, I didn't read that as lighthearted, but that's me. Still, the recognition of the Soviet imaginary as unromanticized because it was thoroughly relied upon as a really great intellectual breakthrough, I think, and very different, for instance, from the 1930s, and also very different from much writing on this complex history. So I'd love to hear more from Rachel, if there's time, about how she came to such an approach, which I think is a model of where the historiography needs to go, or maybe is going. That is the way she uses gender analysis to break open some of the more sterile debates within party history. A very exciting approach, I think, Rachel. Thank you. Hilary tells the story from a different vantage point, really from the metropole, as it were, as to Daria and Vladimir. Hilary reminds us that this was a changing rather than a fixed pole. I think that's really key, okay, that the evolving nationalities question inside the USSR had a major impact on South African communism, particularly with visiting comrades as a transmission belt, and that we ignore these aspects of party history at our peril. As Hilary suggests, post-thaw nationalities policy may have genuinely posited a third way between Western universalism and apartheid and colonial chauvinism, and thus represented a very attractive model for third world revolutionaries, including South Africans drawn to non-racialism. It's quite striking to me, however, I was surprised. I didn't know that Padmore still embraced that vision even after he was at dagger's points with the Comintern. It's also interesting to me that the attraction to the Soviet model for the ANC and the SACP stands as an example, at least in the way Hilary tells it, of South African exceptionalism, a concept now in historiographic bad odor. As Hilary notes, the crucial doorway into this story, though, I don't remember if she read this in her presentation, but it's in the paper. The real way to understand this is through the memoirs and the experience of Black comrades in post-1960 USSR, and Laguma is one of the few with a real memoir. So time for more oral history, and I'm sure Hilary is doing that. I'm especially interested, I would say, in the South African responses to the ethnophilia that she detects in the nationalities policy that really could easily, I think, harden into essentialism. So there's a fine line there between the celebration of Soviet nationalities and the sort of an essentialist ethnophilia. Finally, I'm very interested in Ari's paper, which marries two areas of historiography that really need some rethinking, not just the prisoner of Moscow debate about party history that you're all engaged in, but also a long overdue political, social, and economic history of Bantustans, which, as Walter Sisulu predicted, essentially weighed like a nightmare on the brains of the living today. Arianna is clearly correct to subject ANC-CP analysis of the Bantustan question to serious scrutiny. That said, I'd be curious to see some sources beyond the party theoretical press and Robben Island notes and essays. Private correspondence, for example, like that Rachel minds so well, might be very illuminating if it's available, as might oral histories, which again, I'm sure Ari is doing. As she suggests, after the third period, the part of her paper that she skipped over a bit, but I think it's important, there was a kind of long detour away within South African communism from placing the peasantry at the center of South African revolutionary politics, really between the demise of the ICU and Govan Mbeki's book. All right. Perhaps we might even regard this as a repressed Maoism that only returned in the 1960s after the Sino-Soviet split. It's true that oscillating migrant labor, a continuous feedback loop between the peasantry and the proletariat, must have created an unusually promising revolutionary situation in CP terms in South Africa. But I have yet to see that actually theorized, either by party theorists, unless I'm missing something, or by historians, including Govan Mbeki, who was both essentially. My own sense is that party theoreticians continued, and I would say continue, to treat the peasantry and the proletariat in South Africa as distinctive and relatively fixed and walled off rather than fluid class formations. I'd be happy to be corrected on this assumption, but that's the way it seems to me. As Ari points out, the party, quote, identified the African peasantry as an important ally of the urban working class in the national liberation struggle. But that's very different than observing that these two classes were often made up of the same people, or at least came from interlinked households and networks. Moreover, to the degree that the peasantry was incorporated into Communist Party theory, it seems that it was more at the service of the armed struggle, the contribution it might be able to make as a guerrilla army in the making, that's what Mbeki's writing about in the Peasants' Revolt, rather than organized day-to-day resistance linked in some way to workers' struggles in urban areas, or even the struggle for land in the countryside. So again, maybe this is Martin Legasic speaking through me, but it seems to me that the armed struggle as a theoretical scope tended to capture or subordinate other ideas that might have been fruitful. Even the more systematic class analysis of the homelands offered by Jack Simons and quoted by Ari seemed to still imagine the homelands as spaces walled off from urban South Africa, even though, of course, the peasantry of an independent or pseudo-independent Transkei would surely continue to seek work in East London or even PE. As Billy Nanan, who she also quotes from one of those 1971 documents in Tshepo, pointed out, 40% of the men in the reserves were absent at any one time, working in urban areas. I mean, that's what Billy Nanan says, and then he doesn't interrogate that particular demographic fact at all. Is that the peasantry? If 40% of the men are working in the city and then rotating back? This is a particular kind of class formation that it seems to me the party was rather incurious about, and I would like to know why. As I so often do, I find myself thinking that what we really need as historians is a close look at the border industries, which would answer a lot of these questions, which is the hinge between the peasantry and the proletariat in these areas. Instead, by the 1970s and 80s, discussions about the bantustan seem to have revolved solely around the boycott versus participation poll, and Ari very usefully, breaks down that sort of dichotomy and suggests it's a little more subtle than that. That mirrored similar discussions, of course, taking place on the trade union question, which I'm much more familiar with. Still, it's striking to me that in the sources she uses from that period, the bantustans are understood in very abstract terms. No one is speaking from actual experience from within the homelands, as far as I can tell. And given Hilary's paper, the lack of discussion within the theoretical context of the nationalities question is surprising. Although again, maybe that's there and it just wasn't mentioned by Arianna. But why isn't that theoretical apparatus, already having been developed over 50 years, being applied to the Bantustans? Maybe because it plays to the South African notion, the apartheid notion, these are separate nationalities. I'd be very curious to hear from Ari what some of her conclusions on the CP's ultimate decision to, I would say, keep their distance from the Bantustans. Was this in retrospect a good tactic or not? But certainly this was indicative of the open debate that occurred at the time. Personally, I hunger for a more empirical basis for understanding the shifting class forces and composition of these ersatz states. Who joined this emergent middle class and threw in their stake with the Bantustans, and why? Who refused to? Who's inside the Bantustans? Who stood on the sidelines waiting to see which way the wind was blowing? No doubt the majority of people. That, to my mind, would help us understand the legacy and the afterlives of these peculiar colonial structures of a special type. That's the kind of work I think that Ari, Laura Evans, Laura Phillips, and many others are engaged in, and the early results are promising. It really was a pleasure to read all these papers, and collectively, I think they suggest a way forward that goes well beyond the cul-de-sac of old party history, that is the Ellis, Moscow made me do it, or the, I don't know if I would cast blame on anyone, but a sort of celebratory, everything that the ANC did right was down to the party, and to ask us to focus much more on lived communism, that is the actual experience rather than theoretical debates. The further down that road we go, the more we will understand the history of the ANC and the SACP as a twinned and ever fascinating story. So, and I can't wait to read Tom Lodge's book, which I heard about yesterday, and all of the work that grows out of these fine papers. So I hope I left, yes, a little time for discussion and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. It was very interesting, thought-provoking too. I'd like just to ask the panelists if you could allow, I know that when we started, I'll give you 5 minutes each to respond to Alex, but looking at the time, we out of time. I would like to open the session for people to ask questions, and then if you don't have any question, then you can respond to Alex's reflections. Are there any questions for panelists? Well, while waiting for the questions, maybe any of you could respond to Alex's comments.
Shubin, may I say a few words?
Shubin, yes, go ahead.
Look,
Vladimir.
one question was practically directed to me about the experience during our war and Western Europe. To a large extent, especially in Moscow and around here, and partly and then in the Crimea as well, in the training centers. People who were training the ANC, MK, were not just participants of the big war, but some of them had some experience in the guerrilla warfare as well. What I mean, for example, there was a unit in the general staff dealing with the liberation movements, and the first commander of that unit himself was the head of our mission in Slovakia in 44, 45. And practically he headed, to a large extent, the guerrilla.
Yeah, I mean, this is what I
Yeah.
suspected, right? So these are the people who know how to blow up a railroad track, for
Yeah.
example.
And then the man who was head of what your people called, South African people, ANC people called Northern Training Center at Moscow and around. He himself was commander, started as a platoon commander and ended up as a commander of the guerrilla brigade in the Crimea from 41, from 44, he was doing it. So this experience was there at a much later stage, People, for example, one of the best whom we had in Angola, head of the group for 3 years, he himself spent 2 or 3 years in Afghanistan, and he knew this guerrilla war and anti-guerrilla war very well. This is point number one. Point number two, you spoke about Kalashnikov. Yes, symbol, but for me, I still can't understand. When I came to the international department dealing to some extent with supplies as well, I was surprised that the request from the ANC was mostly SKS, that self-loading carbine, but not Kalashnikov. I asked Moses Mabida why. He said, look, but we should trade them as staunch fighters. Up to me, I can't understand it. And maybe the last point, you see, bantustans, without going into details now, there was a good line or good sentence in the presentation by Arianna that in the 90s, it played very important role, I would say the end of 80s, because maybe, of course, the expectations of the 70s were wrong or premature, but we all know what positive role Bantu Holomisa played in Transkei, you see, when he unbanned ANC himself, when he gave asylum is a wrong word maybe, to Chris Hani, etc. And the very last point, maybe Hilary has seen it, but just since we haven't seen each other for a long time, there was a very good book in Russia, I hope it's still available, by Professor Alpatov about the language policy. It's called 200 Languages, 2 Policies, about these changes in the culture and language policy in our country. Full stop, thank you.
Thank you, Shubin. Do we have any questions from other people in the audience? Sure, people are still thinking about questions. Patrick, there was a question I think that Alex, raised about how was non-racialism promoted?
Yes. Thanks, Dr. Moloi. I needed first to make a mere sentence about the importance that the ANC placed on the politics department and its role at MK in the training program. Not only the training program, but in the life of MK as people lived daily. The politics department in the training program would have taken a lot more hours than any other course, for instance. And so this comes now to the definition of the enemy. Any army that is a group of armed people that assemble must have an enemy. Who then would be the enemy of this army that is assembled? The definition of the enemy became the apartheid system, away from color, the color of one's skin, away from whites as a group being the enemy. but the system, and the definition of the system goes to the concept of the state. What then is the state? The state is the enemy. What is the state? The state symbols, which this is the enemy, the state. The state must be destroyed. The state becomes the enemy of the people, not a group of people, not the white group, so to speak. And that at some moment, the ANC's theory of revolution would have said that the apartheid system actually would at some moment be a fetus to the development of capitalism in South Africa. So the whole of this had the impact of educating members of MK to what really were the nitty-gritty of the very detail of the war, the struggle that they were involved in. I could go on and on. I'm afraid to do that. Alex, I don't know.
I was mostly curious about, what, I mean, as I think you mentioned, Patrick, the Wolfie Kodesh is building up a very substantial library. So what is the pedagogy of non-racialism? What are people being asked to write? What are they being asked to discuss? I mean, that's sort of, I think mostly what I'm interested in.
Well, I need to still build on what I just said, that MK as an army didn't have politics of their own, for instance, didn't have politics that were divorced from the politics of the African National Congress. They were an ANC army. And that's the same way in which the basis of ANC politics was the ANC and the Freedom Charter, for instance, of the Freedom Charter would have been.
Yeah, but again, I don't want to belabor this, but I'm assuming that in 77 and 78, the people who are exfiltrating are all, imbued with BC. And they haven't been talking ANC non-racialism. They're kids, they're 18, 19, 20, and they've been brought up in BC and then Soweto. So they need to be reconscientized, let's say, right? In other words, that just as the people who ended up on the island in 77 and 78 had to engage in dialogue with Mandela and the rest of the ANC comrades and schooled in non-racialism. At least that's what Mandela presents it as do other former prisoners. So that's all. So there was some kind of pedagogical work, I assume, that had to go on in MK camps because the new recruits were not schooled in non-racialism, they were schooled in BC, but just in practical terms.
Which is why.
Let's take a question from the floor.
Can just think about it and then respond. I see that Deborah wants to raise a question. Go ahead, Deborah.
Yeah, that was all absolutely fascinating. I just have a couple of questions for two of the women presenters. So Rachel, excuse my total ignorance, how far had white communists like Hilda, Bernstein and Ray Simons themselves gone to the Soviet Union? I'm a bit hazy on that. To what extent, which would be interesting if it is the case, to what extent is a view of the Soviet Union from female experience coming largely through Black visitors? And then secondly, for Hilary, I wasn't quite sure, and I mean, in a way, it's a question for Vladimir and Daria as well. I wasn't quite sure how far the Soviet Union engages explicitly with Bantustan thinking. I mean, what you had to say about nationality policy was absolutely fascinating. And how much of an obstacle is it and a difficulty with the sort of debating about the Bantustans that Arianna was raising? So what's the interlink between Russia wrestling with this sort of incredible, I mean, we think 11 languages is a lot, but the Soviet Union had so much more of a polyglot situation to deal with. So I just was interested in that interface. Thanks.
Thanks, Deborah. Hilary, there's another question for you from Derek Glazer. Was there a trace of Soviet nationality policy in the brief appearance of 4 nations in the Freedom Charter? I can't see any other trace of it in ANC or SACP. And then there's another, I think from Laszlo Pasamias. How do we, it's not addressed to anyone in particular, how do we assess the ideological commitment of liberation movements? How do we account for different interpretations of visions by various leaders, or measure to what extent thought ideology was understood, supported, and advanced by the rank and file? So I think Rachel and Hilary could go, and then I know Daria hasn't said anything, and then Arianna as well, if you want to take on Laszlo's question.
Okay, I can go. Thank you. Thank you for, thanks to Alex for the comments, and then also thanks to Deborah Gitskill for the question. Okay, so regarding the question about, white communist women traveling to the Soviet Union, it's a really good point and an interesting one. They certainly did. Ray Simons was there, I think, kind of often, but it's a funny feature of her archive is that she has a few copies of her own letters, but many more copies of women writing to her. So she's the kind of crucial relay point, but her own impressions and words are harder to capture. Of course, she does have a memoir which discusses it in more depth. And for Hilda Bernstein as well, again, she did travel to the Soviet Union, and I should look more at it, especially because wonderfully her archive is digitized, and she's a very beautiful writer. So she certainly has very sort of evocative descriptions of travel and kind of sardonic discussions of meetings. And she's got this beautiful discussion of some meeting, I think actually in Prague, not in the Soviet Union, but of people getting drunk and being really strange, which is quite fascinating. And but anyway, so I'm looking at those questions, and it is interesting, and I think similar elements could be seen there. So it's a good point that I should keep following up. And with Alex, your point about tone, I think is a good one. The tone, I've gone over these letters time and time again, because the tone is very hard to figure out. In particular, because I actually think Ruslan Padi and Florence Mofosho at some periods over these long years violently disliked each other and really fell out with each other, and I can't figure out why, and I can't figure out what Ray Simons thought and who was closer to her and who was more in her confidence, and to the extent that there was a side to be on, which side was she on? But I do think in Ruslan Padi anyway, she's got this very wry, sardonic tone where she can laugh about it, whereas Florence Mofosho, who had a harder life and I think was quite ill and lost her daughter and never got her daughter back and so on, I think there's more complaint and suffering throughout her experiences.
Did Elizabeth Mafiking ever travel to the Soviet Union, as far as you know? I think she went to Hungary, if I remember correctly, in the 50s, but
I know I should read Holly McGee's book on her, which I haven't read yet. For sure she traveled up, but I'm not sure she went to the Soviet Union. She might have done, though, because Lily Ngoy and Dora Tamana did. So she might have gone around that time.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. Hilary, you wanna say something about what Deborah asked?
Yes, so thanks for the question, and also thanks Alex for the comments. And Deborah's question is a great way to pick up on one of the threads that Alex was pulling on, which was so what about this ethnophilia and the kind of essentialist turn that it took, especially in the later years, and the way that it paralleled the thinking about culture in the apartheid state. And so that's the sort of, yes, that's a teaser for the next stage of this story, as I would consider it. So the kind of, in my view of the chronology, the kind of peak point of experiencing some sort of commonality is during the thaw years in the Soviet Union, and the sort of Khrushchev attempt to remake a new Soviet social contract after Stalin, and especially to sort of engage in anti-imperialism, both within the Soviet Union with sort of renewed attention to Soviet peripheries as well as abroad. And that commitment sort of stayed, it stayed rhetorically present as it decayed in all kinds of ways. And so I think the story of the 1970s and 80s is very much of the ANC-SACP alliance heading in one direction of becoming more and more sort of rigorously anti-ethnic, in quite, in some ways, quite narrow or inflexible terms, and the Soviet Union not on the level of official ideology, but in so many ways in sort of in daily life, in the way that anthropologists were thinking about culture. Sort of there's a very marked drift towards thinking about deep essences and ethnic selves that are increasingly biologized. And eventually that sort of culminates in a very strange turn of events, which is as negotiations start and federalism starts to become the sort of innate way of remaking the apartheid project for a democratic order, the Soviet Union becomes a really important point of reference for the legitimacy of ethnic self-determination, and especially the Soviet breakup. And so these stories cross over each other in like very, very shifting, complicated, unpredictable ways. But the general story is, as I see it, of a gradual and then quite remarkable divergence between ANC and Soviet thinking about culture.
Thanks, Hilary.
Shall I come in?
Yes,
Tshepo?
please. Sure.
Thanks, Alex, for the comments and for taking time to read all of our papers. I hope you're gonna share with us your written notes, because that'd be really useful. Just a couple of things in terms of the, SACP's notion of a peasantry, which, in a way, I think you are right. It was quite limited and fixed, but I think that part of the reason was that they saw migrant laborers basically as urban workers, and that's why, in essence, urban areas and the urban working class, I think, ultimately. Throughout much of apartheid's history, in spite of moments where attention is paid to rural areas, are seen as constituting the vanguard of a struggle. Just very briefly, so no interest, the kind of Soviet nationality policy doesn't get applied at all in this context, although I think in initial engagements with organizations such as in Qatar, the whole idea of a cultural organization for promoting cultural rights and so on is seen initially in positive terms, although that turns quite quickly. But as Hilary mentioned later on, actually, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and after 1990, when the Bantustans are fighting to retain a separate existence within a future South African state, increasingly there are these connections made between former Soviet countries and the Bantustans in efforts to kind of give a reciprocal legitimacy to each other, with the kind of exchanges at government level and so on. I just had a very brief comment for Rachel. You must read, if you haven't read it, Hilda Bernstein's book on her family's entanglement with the Soviet Union. Her father was a Bolshevik. She was born in London, where her family was in exile, but the father then returned to the Soviet Union after the October Revolution and worked and died in the Soviet Union. And then one of his sisters married an American that had also kind of remained in the Soviet Union after the revolution. And she remained there in spite of, you know, a very complicated personal stories and trajectories of the family. It's a beautiful book. It's published by Jacana. And to Patrick, I had a, that was really great. I hear you about, well, my only point is around what you call the waning of SACP influence on MK during the 1960s, which you seem to ascribe to the fact that, you know, there wasn't a lot of support for Wanki. But in fact, it seems that you need to place this waning of interest within the context of a kind of reorganizing of the various Congress Alliance partners in exile, but mainly the ANC and the SACP, and the fact that the party itself, well, the majority of the party ends up in London, with the general secretary and the chairman both based in Tanzania and working full time with the ANC, and the kind of tensions that sort of emerge in this period. And the fact that my understanding is that in this period, the party did not have, in spite of making a significant contribution to the turn to arms struggle and the sabotage campaign and the, you know, up to the sort of Rivonia and Little Rivonia period, but in the camps in the 1960s, the SACP didn't have a separate, didn't have its own organized presence, and it's only in the 70s that they re-established units in MK. Thanks a lot to everyone.
Thank you. We've run out of time, Mara. Just to push it a bit, can we ask Daria to say, have a last response? Either to question raised by Laszlo or to Alex's comments earlier?
I think we just need to maybe take into account more oral researches, not only archival, which we are presenting here, but also the stories of people who were literally been in Soviet Union, because not many books are still published. And because of the time, unfortunately, it's influenced and people are already gone. And we will never know what was basically the truth, because the generations are changing, and it would be much more difficult than just to dig it up and just to find out how it was for them to be living socialism at that time. Because mostly when we're coping with this topic of memoirs, we only take into account, and we have the books of very high members of the party, but we don't really have a lot of books connected to middle, let's put it like middle members of the party. So we don't really know, and that's just, we should also keep it into account just to understand and to shape this understanding of this topic. I think I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daria. We've gone beyond 5:30. I would like to thank everyone, particularly our panelists, for interesting and fascinating papers, and Alex for thought-provoking comments. I think we raised some interesting questions, which I hope, we can discuss beyond this platform. I think my task ends here. I will ask Arianna to say something about the next webinar. I think we have got the last one, and then maybe about the recording for anyone who would like to get the recording.